All right. Well, today on the show, we are honored to have Tod Bolsinger with us. Todd, how are you today?
I'm doing very well, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Todd, you just came out with a brand new book called Tempered Resilience. And I would love for you to just introduce to our audience what is the book about? What's Tempered Resilience all about?
Yeah, so I wrote a book that came out in 2015 called Canoeing the Mountains, which was a book about change and about how do you lead change when you are in uncharted territory, when you can't rely on your past expertise. And so that book took me literally all over the world. I mean, I got to travel to 4 different countries and all over the country. And what I found is when I was talking about the concepts of adaptive change that I bring out in the book, what often happened is people would come to me and say something like one senior pastor said to me, which is, Todd, I'm pretty sure I can learn to lead change. I'm not sure I can survive it.
Hmm.
Because what became really apparent is the most difficult part about leading change isn't the changing world outside the door. It is the internal resistance of your own people in the changes they need to make in order to face those challenges of a changing world. And that internal resistance requires a kind of resilience. So I started studying basically the overlap between leadership development theory on how do you develop resilience and spiritual formation out of my Christian tradition. And what I really found is that resilience, the way we need to think of it for this kind of changes needed in the church today, is a wise, tempered resilience, like a tempered tool, like the way in which you take a steel and you turn it into something that is both stronger and more flexible than its raw material through the process of tempering.
And so from that comes the idea of tempered leadership. And so what is tempered leadership?
Well, so I would say it's tempered resilient leadership, right? So the tempering is the reminder. So part of it for me is the model here is actually comes from a line in Dr. Martin Luther King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech, which most people don't realize is the "I Have a Dream" section was ad-libbed at that moment. And it's because it was part of a speech that he had been doing all around the country during the civil rights movement. And he has this line where he quotes Isaiah 40. And then he says, vision of the world being transformed that Isaiah 40 shows. He says, with faith, I go back to the South. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of a mountain of despair stones of hope. And I love that verb hew. So what do you do when you have a mountain of despair in front of it? You don't smash through it with a sledgehammer. You don't blow it up with dynamite. You don't cower in front of it and walk away. You actually transform it. That's the line. Hew out of a mountain of despair, stones of hope, transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. And that notion of hew and transform became important. So a tempered tool, like a chisel as opposed to a sledgehammer, is one that can actually transform what is despairing rock into stones that can be used to build something beautiful.
Yeah. And so one of the big concepts you talk about in your book is adaptive leadership and adaptive capacity. We're recording this right in the middle of, well, it seems like the middle, who knows how long the middle or this whole season lasts of COVID-19. We're recording right in the middle of this. And how is this a moment for adaptive leadership and adaptive capacity? You might even want to tell us what those things are and what is it about this particular moment that makes that necessary?
Yeah, so adaptive leadership comes from the work of Ronald Heifetz and his colleagues at Harvard, where they talked about the kind of leadership needed when your expertise doesn't work, right? There's certain kinds of leadership where you are an expert. That they call that technical competence. So if you're flying a plane, or if you're doing a heart bypass, or I say if you're preaching on the Trinity, right? We teach people, I work at a seminary, we teach people how to do that wisely and well and faithfully. Those are hard challenges, but experts can solve it. An adaptive challenge is when there's no expertise, when you're in a place where none of your past expertise will help you. Your wisdom, your experience, that'll help. But what you actually have to do at that moment is acknowledge that your next step of leadership is to say out loud, I don't know what we're going to do, and yet we are going to learn. and we are going to face whatever losses we need to face in order to proceed on. And Canoeing the Mountains was built on the whole metaphor of the Lewis and Clark expedition, where they thought there would be a water route that would take them all the way from the Mississippi River to the Pacific Ocean. And after going thousands of miles up the Missouri River, they ran into the Rocky Mountains. And if you are planning on traveling into the future on a canoe and you hit mountains, it doesn't do you any good to keep paddling harder. You've got to drop the canoe and you've got to figure out how you navigate these mountains that you didn't believe were there in the first place. And so adaptive leadership is like that. This is where I said that the whole world is in this moment, and every industry, and it's a profoundly painful moment. Somebody said it's 1918, 1929, and 1968 all at the same time, right? It's the pandemic, it's a global recession, it's got social uprising, we have all these things happening, and we are facing all these challenges at exactly the same time. And there isn't anybody alive who's ever been in a moment like this before. So any leader who tells you, I alone can fix it, I'm the expert that can do it, they're lying to you, because no one's been here. What it takes is a kind of vulnerable leadership that is willing to learn, face some necessary losses. You got canoes you're going to have to drop, and continue to move forward with resiliency and hope.
Yeah. As you say that, when you say that the people who say this is what we need to do, even though we've never been here, this is exactly the next step, they're all lying.
Yeah.
I can think about every email that I've got as a church leader in the pandemic telling me, this is exactly what you need to do. This is your next step. I don't know if I've heard anybody say, I don't know what to do.
Yeah, exactly. So this is, I mean, what's really interesting is you'll notice the experts, I mean, the smartest people, I mean, not just what I would say is the wisest people. Let me be really clear about this. The wisest people are the people who say, we are going to trust what we know. We're going to take the next step, and then we're going to figure out what we need to know next. We're going to go one step at a time, not like there's some magical formula. So, you know, you see this already. I work in churches and nonprofits, and everybody's asking, so, you know, how soon can we get back to normal? Almost everybody says there will be no back to normal. Yeah. There'll be some version of the future that is both what was before COVID and what we learned in the middle of COVID. And the future is not going to be about going back. It's going to be about moving forward. And whoever can learn the fastest, and whoever can experiment and learn from their failures and learn the lessons, are going to be the people who survive and thrive in the new day.
Yeah. Does that start in that moment of vulnerability that says, I don't know?
Yeah. This is why I said here's the big irony about tempered steel is the tempered steel. This entire book is a blacksmithing metaphor.
Yeah.
And I'm not a blacksmith. I'm a guy who lives in Los Angeles, right? So I took a class from an urban blacksmithing community in a neighborhood where there hasn't been a horse there in 100 years. But there's a bunch of these artisans who have taken the ancient art of blacksmithing and really learned a lot about it. And I took some classes just because I was fascinated. And what they basically teach you is you take steel, raw material, steel. The very first thing you got to do to turn that into a tool is you got to melt it down.
Yeah.
And that putting it in the fire until it becomes flexible, molten, oozy, is the key to shaping it into a tool that can do more than it could have done as raw steel. And that's exactly where I think the leadership challenge is. The very first thing that has to happen is you've got to be able to face the vulnerability of being able to say, I don't know what's going to happen next. I'm probably disappointing you as a leader because you're all looking for the expert who will tell you exactly what to do. And what we're going to have to actually do is trust me that we're going to go through this together and we're going to learn as we go. Yeah. And that process is what's needed in this time of change.
What is it that just makes that so hard? That moment of vulnerability where a leader says, I don't know what we're doing. I don't know what the next step is exactly. I don't know what to do. What makes that so hard just to admit?
Well, there's two parts. One is nobody likes feeling dumb. And what happens is when you've been made the leader. So this is the thing I always say, the moment you've been been asked to be a leader of a group, right after you probably had biggest success as a non-leader.
Hmm.
Like you were the if you became the sales manager, you were probably the leading salesperson. If you became the pastor, you were probably the best preacher, the best speaker. If you became the dean, it's probably because you were the scholar who published the most, right? In your technical expertise, you can find a kind of affirmation. People trust you and they like you and they affirm you. You then become the leader, and you have to be the person who says, I don't know what's next, but we're going to learn. And people are disappointed in you
Hmm.
because what people want is the safety and security of someone who will give them easy solutions. And there is nothing about the day that we're in that gives us easy solutions. And that feels vulnerable.
Yeah. And so that that reminds me of a part of your book that I just thought was so powerful. How leaders need to be grounded in
Yeah.
something other than their success.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, what is that? What do they need to be grounded in?
Yeah. So this is the irony, right? So strength comes from vulnerability. This happens. We see this. Resilience comes through a process of formation, not through just gritting our teeth. It actually allows yourself to be formed. And that one of the things that's most powerful is that to have the raw material for being able to be a person who can go through and lead change is you have to be grounded in something other than your success at change. If the most important thing is that you're successful, you will give up because you're going to go through hard times. So you have to be grounded in something else. And for me as a Christian, this is really where the example of Jesus is so profound to me. Before Jesus does anything, before he preaches a sermon, does a miracle, casts out a demon, confronts a power, the very first thing he experiences is a voice that says to him, "You are my beloved."
Hmm.
You haven't done anything yet, but you're already my beloved. In you I am well pleased. Eugene Peterson's translation says, "You are the pride of my life."
Yeah.
And what I think is every leader needs to know, you are already loved. You are already grounded in something that is not going to change. You are already secure and fixed in the love of God that is there for you already. And now, out of that love, you can risk to be vulnerable. You can learn. You can losses. You can take people through disappointment. You can bring change.
Yeah. Todd, how does a leader, or anybody rather, go about the process of becoming grounded in that identity that we have in Christ? How do we do that?
Well, I think the most important thing, first of all, is to acknowledge how ungrounded we feel, right? So this is, I mean, the whole notion of, Saint Augustine used to say, you have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until we rest in you. And I think one of the things that we can learn from that is the anxiety we often feel, the restlessness we feel, the longing for more, the sense that no matter what we've accomplished, it isn't enough, or the internal shame that says that no matter how good you are, you're actually just a faker, you're an imposter. Those are normal human conditions.
Okay.
Everybody feels that way. So then to hear the fact that the God who created you and knows you by name, who literally the scriptures say has your name etched in his hands, like tattooed on his hands, that God who knows you already loves you. And that God who then calls us to service or to participate in God's work to change the world, to leadership that it will require, does so as someone who's already decided that you are worthy of love.
Mm.
And that notion is really important because you're going to face things that are really, really hard.
Yeah. I think one of the things that stood out to me from your book so much is that it's really a book about formation.
Yeah.
You talk about spiritual formation, and there's so few leadership books, particularly in the church, even about spiritual formation. Um, why do you think that is? Why do you think there is maybe a lack of emphasis on the leader's need for their own spiritual formation,
Yeah.
and what we see is an emphasis on, you know, you need to have the big vision, ready to charge the hill, break the next growth barrier, those kind of things.
Well, because I think there's two assumptions that are really not very biblical assumptions. They're not profoundly Christian. They've been affected by other parts of our society. One assumption is that leaders are born; they're just naturally charismatic.
Yeah.
And that you pick the tallest person, you pick the most handsome, the most articulate, the smartest. And the scriptures tell us now that's Saul, not David. Like that's the wrong one. You don't pick Moses, you pick Pharaoh, right? If you're like, no, the scriptures say you pick Moses, the one who was so broken that he was out in the wilderness and God had to go speak. You pick David, who was the runt of the litter.
Hmm.
You find the person after God's own heart is the person chosen by God, not because they're great, but because God is to work with them and they say yes to God. And some things we have to learn is I really believe leaders are formed. We
Yeah.
form people for leadership. Leadership isn't a title. Leadership is a function. It's not about having heavy furniture in a corner office. It's about stepping up and saying, I am going to gather people together to respond to a pain point in the world to bring hope and change. And it's going to require us to change.
Mm-hmm.
So the first thing you have to grapple with leadership is that most of us think leaders are magical people, and they're not. They're actually formed normal people. They are shaped and formed over time, and that you are formed for your character. One of the a Marine Corps jet fighter pilot once said, "You do not rise to the occasion. At the moment of crisis, you do not rise to the occasion. You default to your training."
Hmm.
And I was a pastor in a community close to Camp Pendleton Marine Base. They believe deeply in training, and formation is the Christian way of talking about training.
Yeah.
And so resilience is formed over time. But the other, so one problem is the believing that leaders are naturally built, and they're born, not made. That's a problem. They're actually made, not born. The other problem is the belief that in a crisis you'll just rise above yourself. You'll just rise to the occasion. You'll just do it. All you just need to do. And the answer is no, you don't. You actually need to be formed for it. You have to be shaped. I mean, literally, we even have in the scriptures, Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature. Jesus grew, like it says in Luke chapter 2. Like, so that notion of formation is so central to what it means to be a Christian, that leadership formation has to be really central. And that even the notion of resilience, we think resilience is just the tough person who will just gut it out. Resilience actually is formed. It's shaped through a process of reflection and relationships and spiritual practices. And that's what this book is about. It's about the formation of resilient leaders.
Yeah. One of the things I've heard several people talk about in this season is how many leaders will potentially simply quit.
Yeah.
And what do you think that reveals about the formation of our leadership, particularly in the church? What do you think that might reveal about the way that we're forming leaders, or the way that we just think about formation itself?
Yeah. So before the pandemic, when Canoeing the Mountains, my first book, came out, it was entirely about the way in which our struggle as a church was that for 1700 years, our location of the church was in the center of culture. It's what we call Christendom. It meant that churches have a home court advantage, right? That the culture supported Christianity, especially in the West. And so what you end up with is a group of people who are really good at being religious folks in the middle of a culture that supports them. So I served at a church, Hollywood Presbyterian Church, which was one time, a generation ago, the largest Presbyterian church in the country. And I served there on their associate pastoral staff and as a young trainee through seminary when they had about half the membership of their peak. They had about 4,000 members. And but in 1963, they had 9,000 members, and they were featured in the Los Angeles Times. I have an article that they were featured on. But what was interesting about it is in the Los Angeles Times in 1963, the Los Angeles Times used to also print a week's worth of daily Bible readings.
Wow.
So a generation ago, the Los Angeles Times helped you with your morning quiet time. And if you were shaped and trained, and if you continue to shape and train people, assuming that we live in a world where the Los Angeles Times should provide daily Bible readings, you're going to have a really hard time when we live in a world where we don't. And so to move into a post-Christendom world, a world where Christianity is no longer has a home court advantage, but now has to actually minister from the margins or from the places where that is much more like we see in the early church. We've not been formed for that. We've not shaped people for that. The early church was a home church movement. And today, what's weird is the places that are growing fastest in the world today are in the majority world that are mostly home church movements. It's more like the early church. But we've spent the past couple centuries developing these institutions and organizations that are meant to have credibility within the culture. And that hasn't shaped us for the new world that we're in. And so I think that disruption is really hitting people deeply. And I also think a lot of leaders right now, they're just discouraged because this isn't what they signed up for, right? That like I always say everybody who comes to seminary where I work, somebody said to them, "You're the best Christian I know. You should go pro." And they go off to professional Christian school. And what they mean is, I'm going to learn preaching and pastoral care and how to do good programs. And then I'm going to come back to my church or come back to some other church in my denomination. And I'm going to then just be the professional Christian who runs the church. And everybody knows what that is. What happens when all of a sudden we can't gather people to preach?
Yeah.
You can't go see people for pastoral care, at least not face to face. And there's not a single program that you can run right now that you can count on. Maybe you can do it for a week, maybe 6 weeks, maybe not again. If everything's disrupted, then what does it mean for us to be a church that is a community of people who have to have a whole different set of practices, a whole different set of ways of gathering? Nobody who's in leadership today expected that they would be doing Bible studies over Zoom, or that they would be trying to figure out how to navigate churches that are in deep division over whether we should wear masks or not, or gather or not. Those weren't the questions they went to seminary to do. It's exhausting. It's hard work. But this is why this is a moment for leadership. And it's a moment why we need to have tempered, resilient leadership.
Yeah. One of the things you talk about in your book is how stress can lead to us becoming those kind of resilient leaders. I know a lot of leaders who went through stress and just got bitter, cynical, and I can even see that in my own life in a lot of ways. How do you prevent that from happening? How do you actually handle the stress of leadership, or walk through it rather, and it makes you into this tempered leader rather than a bitter leader?
Yeah. So it's the right question, Mark. Because here's the irony. Remember, this is the thing that is so interesting. If you take raw steel and you heat it up so that it becomes vulnerable, becomes like loose, malleable, and you hold it securely on an anvil, start pounding on it to shape it, to turn it from steel into a tool. Every single time you strike it with the hammer, you are not only shaping the form, but you are adding stress. You're actually compacting the molecules, so it's getting stronger and stronger and stronger. When it gets to the place where it's at the perfect peak of stress, what you actually have to do now is cool it back down so that it takes some of the stress out of it. So you add stress and then you relieve the stress, and the relieving of some of the stress is the tempering. The goal is to make it stronger and more flexible. And that's a process. That's a repetitive process of adding stress, relieving stress, and of adding stress and of relieving stress. What it means is you just can't keep hammering away. Yeah. And what happened in this pandemic for others is they feel all they're doing is just hammering away They're just pounding away at something that's not working. And if you keep hammering and hammering and hammering on the steel, you will eventually break it. It becomes brittle.
Hmm.
The opposite of tempered is not it's not soft. It's brittle.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
many of us who are getting burned out not because we're not working hard enough. Every pastor I know, every leader I know is working as hard as they ever imagined. It's that they're becoming brittle because they don't have a rhythm of being able to take on the stress and then relieve it. Or they're trying to do it alone. Or they're trying to do the old things they used to do, but just with more energy and activity, just pounding away harder and harder and harder. And that's why there needs to be a rhythm of leading and not leading.
Yeah. Can you talk about what that rhythm might look like?
Well, I think it's two things. One is I think there's no doubt, and there's lots of conversation out there and lots of experts who talk about the need for self-care. And so I'm a huge advocate that people in leadership need self-care. You got to take Sabbaths, you got to take care of your health, you got to take care of your family. You've got to take care of yourself. But that's not the only thing. What you also need is places where you have the opportunity to keep growing without it depending on someone else, without it making an impact on someone else.
Oh, okay.
So I need places in my life where I'm the leader. That's my call. But I also need places in my life where I'm not. Right? Like so in the middle of COVID, the one thing I'm not going to do is ever pretend that I'm an epidemiologist. I am not. Like I have a PhD and it's not that subject.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to be the expert for my community. The churches I know that are doing really well in COVID are the people who are saying, we're going to listen to medical experts on the medicine and we're going to focus aspects of what it means to do the call of the gospel. So many pastors think that they've got to be the expert on everything.
Yeah.
And that over time becomes stress and stress. So you got to know where you're leading. And you got to have a rhythm in your life of things that also help you to rest, to relax. One of the most powerful parts of my life now is that after 27 years of being a preacher and a pastor, I'm now a consultant and a professor. And so when I show up at church on Sunday mornings or now on Zoom, I'm not leading it.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to oftentimes remind myself, you're not in charge here.
Yeah.
Like your job is to be a worshiper. Your job is to receive. Your job is to lay your burdens, confess your sins, respond to the gospel. Your job isn't to lead this. And I need to do that not just because it's true, I'm not the leader, but because I need to be reminded that I'm not leading in every place I am.
Yeah. So what you're describing sounds like self-awareness.
Yeah.
In a
Yeah.
lot of ways. What is self-awareness? You talk about it in your book, but what is self-awareness, and how can a leader actually grow in self-awareness?
Well, the whole notion of self-awareness is built on the idea that that if the an educator named John Dewey said, "You don't learn from experience; you learn by reflecting on experience." And the most important thing for most of us as leaders isn't what's happening around us; it's how we respond to it.
Hmm.
Almost everybody will forgive us if a circumstance that is beyond our control overwhelms us. What they want for the leader is for you to respond wisely and well to that circumstance. So the first thing you have to do is become aware of what's going on with you. If you're so anxious, or you're trying so hard to impress people, or you're trying to demonstrate that you really are in control when you're not, then ultimately you will end up making worse mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
So the first part of a tempered leader is the acknowledgement, the self-aware acknowledgement that, and we're back to, I'm the learner. I'm going to lead the learning. I'm not the person who has the answer, but we together are going to go through this. We're also not going to stop. We're going to have to go through this, and we're going to come out the other side. And we don't know what it looks like yet, but we're going to learn as we go. We're going to take the best wisdom with us. We're not going to sacrifice our deepest core values, the things that make us who we are. we're going to keep going, and we're going to learn as we go, and we'll lose the things we have to drop, and we'll keep going.
Yeah. And so a part of self-awareness is really being aware of just some of the things that are happening inside of me,
Mm-hmm.
in those moments of stress.
Yeah.
Why
Yeah.
am I so anxious? And that's
In the book, I talk a lot about the very first thing you have to do, most of us as leaders have to do, is whenever we have something happens to us, we have to manage our reactivity. Our
okay.
first response is to react.
Yeah.
What you actually need to do is to calm down enough to figure out what a wise response is. So the first thing that we're almost always having to do is just take a deep breath and not react. And that's hard. I mean, that's very hard. I mean, I want to jump into the fire to be the hero, and then I ask myself the question: am I trained for fires, or should I be the guy who calls the fire department? Right? Like my desire to be the hero could be a problem here. I can make it worse, or I can be so fearful that I do nothing. And I think, well, is my fear keeping me from doing the thing I can do? Right.
Yeah.
So that sense of growing self-awareness is really important. I mean, the scriptures are filled with this notion of, search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxious thoughts.
Yeah.
Right? Know my anxious thoughts. Help me to see my anxious thoughts. Help me to know what is hurtful and harmful, and particularly harmful to other people, and lead me in the right way.
Yeah. Another part of that process that you mentioned a minute ago is how important relationships are
Mm-hmm.
for leaders. And one of the things that we see, unfortunately, regularly is just leaders that fall
Yeah.
for one thing or another. A lot of times when that happens, it turns out that leader was alone, even though it might have been in the middle of a big organization, big church, something like that. But that leader was alone.
Yeah.
What are some relationships that leaders need to have if they're going to be resilient leaders?
Yeah. So the imagery that was so striking to me when I was doing my blacksmithing class was that right after you take the steel out of the fire, it's like orange and it's almost liquid. It's just oozy. You can't imagine this thing that is almost like a popsicle on a stick melting in front of you is going to become a tool that's going to be used to, chisel stone. But the way it gets there is the first thing you do is you put it on an anvil, and the anvil holds it. You need something so solid and so big and so strong and so enduring that can hold the ooziness, the vulnerability of the steel. Then you can start the formation process. And what most of us, we know from just data, is that most leaders, they're missing the anvil. They might feel vulnerable, can't stand the heat, stay out of the kitchen, it's pretty hot there. And they might even have some spiritual practices or some leadership practices, but what they often miss is that anvil that holds them. And I always say every leader needs an anvil made up of 3 types of relationships that every leader needs. You need partners, you need mentors, and you need friends. You need people in that ministry and in that work with you. There is, even if you are the sole pastor of a church, you are not a solo pastor. You are the person whose responsibility is to gather a community of people to do the mission of God. So you need partners, and you need people who care as much about what God is asking you to do and loving God and loving neighbors as you care about it. But you also need mentors. You need coaches and spiritual directors and therapists and people who can give you wise advice and counsel and care for you. There's not a single professional athlete that doesn't have a coach, and they're the best in the world. And it's interesting to me how many people I know who are doing really important work, like working with human beings, think they can do it by themselves. And so I'm just a huge believer. I always said that I'm a Presbyterian, but if I was a Methodist or a Lutheran or Episcopalian where they had bishops and I could be a bishop, I sometimes joke to my bishop friends, I would say, look, if you lead anything in my diocese and you don't have a spiritual director, a therapist, or a coach, I'm going to consider that leadership malpractice.
Wow.
If you actually think you can do this by yourself, I didn't get that myself. That didn't come up with it myself. I came up with that because my wife was a marriage and family therapist. And she said to me one time, you know, Todd, as a therapist, if I don't have supervision and I make a mistake, I'm held more liable. I have 15 clients and I have a supervisor. Todd, you have 1,500 members and nobody ever asks you anything.
Wow.
And she said this because she was serving in our presbytery on our clergy sexual misconduct task force. And when she would talk to one person after another who was abused because pastors had unhealthy boundaries, very often they were the people who were the most alone.
Yeah.
So you need partners and you need mentors. And the last thing you need is you need friends. You just, I mean, this is the part where there's a huge conversation right now. The pandemic has revealed that many people, especially many men, don't have enough good friends, just friends who love them and people who care about them. And I said, a friend is someone who cares more about you than they care about your mission. They're the person who says, hey, look, I know you're doing something really, really, really important, but you know, would you want to grab a cup of coffee? Like, you know, like I know your Sundays are really, really busy, and I'm all in favor of you, but I kind of want to know how you're doing with your kids, right? Your friends are the people who care more about you than your. So you need all three. You need to have all three in your life. That's how heavy the anvil of relationships has to be.
Yeah. Wow. What does it say, Todd? You know, thinking about our leadership culture, what does it say that so many of our examples of leadership are people, maybe they're put on a pedestal of leadership because they just experienced what seemed to be quick overnight success. You know, they lead this big thing, this big church, and those are the examples that we're given. And we're not really given examples of tempered leadership. You know, this is somebody that they've been through some stuff, and you know, they're still, you know, loving God, loving people, and that sort of thing. What is it? What's that reveal about our leadership culture?
Well, one of the things it reveals is that we prefer the myth to the reality.
Yeah.
You know, that we really believe the myth that there are just these natural born geniuses who are going to make our life better.
Hmm.
They're magical.
Yeah.
And the truth is, none of them are like that, right? Like none, no significant leader. I mean, George Washington lost a bunch of battles before he finally was able to win the Revolutionary War. You can go read Doris Kearns Goodwin's book about leadership and presidential leadership. Every single one of them had who were the most remarkable leaders: FDR, Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt. They all had massive setbacks, horribly painful experiences that made them stronger. Um, it's a myth. And what's really crazy about that is the church seems to be more addicted to that myth, even though the scriptures are filled with the stories about the way in which the very best leaders are the people who had to grow and be transformed and changed. I mean, the first, significant leader in the church was called Satan one day by Jesus because he got it so bad. You know, if Jesus calls you Satan, it's a bad day. But Peter not only was called Satan, Peter also failed Jesus terribly when a little girl asked him if he was a follower. And Peter understood that. Paul was a person who had been broken and opposed Christianity. Like, you see these pictures, the scriptures are so clear that leadership is formed over time. And we instead buy into the myth that it was something magical. It is completely unchristian, and we have bought it hook, line, and sinker.
Wow. Todd, when I listened to you talk, and this is in your book too, I was thinking as well, but really when I listen to you talk, it sounds like we need to completely revolutionize the way we think about leadership and train leaders in the church.
Yeah.
Todd, if you could do that, where would you start?
Well, this is now what I do, actually.
Yeah.
So after 27 years of being a pastor in churches, I got a chance to go back to my seminary, the place where I was trained to get my master's of divinity, my PhD, And I came back to help them shift the whole way we do theological education.
Yeah.
And after making some significant changes that were really much more about putting formation in the center of our education and putting lifetime formation. So it wasn't just about getting degrees. Like we give degrees and you can get initials after your name, but leadership requires you to be able to keep learning when you don't have any more money to spend and you don't need any more initials. So to put formation in the center of what we do for a lifetime became the work that I did at our seminary, and with a whole team of people serving our president. And now when that process had been completed, or at least the plan for that process was completed, I just said, all I want to do is now work for the rest of my life with church leaders. And so they created the Church Leadership Initiative for me that's out of our Pree Center at Fuller Seminary. And so the Pree Center for Leadership now has a Church Leadership Initiative, and I get to spend the rest of my life working on this, which is really helping people learn to lead all over again for this different world. That's what I do.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I love it. Tod, I want to honor your time. Just one more question. What would you say to the leader that might be watching this, they're listening to this, and they are discouraged? They are about to throw in the towel, and they haven't told anybody. But as they listen to you talk, that you're just speaking to something deep inside of them, and they are just really on the brink of walking away. What would you say to them?
One of my favorite stories comes from a poet named David White, who was meeting with a monk named Brother David. And so the poet David says to the monk, Brother David, tell me about exhaustion. Like there's a lead in for a monk, right? Yeah. And the monk looks at him really, really seriously and says, the antidote for exhaustion is not necessarily rest. And the poet David says, it's not necessarily rest. What is it? It says, the antidote for exhaustion is wholeheartedness. He goes on to say, you're only half here. And after a while, being half here will kill you. And what most leaders who are exhausted today, and I understand this deeply, I have been there, is that doing the work that you are called to do with half of your heart will eventually destroy you. You need to be more wholehearted. But the answer isn't, as we've been talking about, just to rise to the occasion, to gut it out. The answer is actually to keep growing deeper into your self-awareness about what it means for you to give your whole self to something that is bigger than you. And once you can give yourself wholly to something that is bigger than you, if you can believe that you were formed for this moment, that you are in this challenge, that this is exactly what you're about, and there's a way for you to do that you can do it wholeheartedly. You're not trying to be somebody else. It's you being wholehearted there. You will find the energy that will allow you to express yourself wholeheartedly into your work and to find the energy that will carry you through. And that's what resilience is. Yeah. Resilience is your capacity to keep being formed, to be both stronger and flexible because you believe you're going to be part of something that's going to transform despair into hope. And you get to be a small part of that. You are just a small chisel in the hand of God.
Yeah. I think that's a great place to wrap up our conversation. Tod, how can people who are interacting with this, they're watching those, and how can they get in touch with you? How can they interact with your content and everything you're doing?
Well, the easiest way, I have a really great team that set this up for me, so it's really easy. The easiest way is if you just send a text message. You just send the word change, that's the word, okay, to 66866. Change to 66866. It's too many sixes in a row for a pastor, but it does okay. Change to 66866. And you send that text message, what you'll do is you'll get connected to the Pree Center's Church Leadership Initiative, and there's all kinds of resources for coaching and consulting and writing and the things we do, and you can get in touch with me directly through that. So change 66866.
Great. And we'll make sure to put that in the show notes as well. And Tod, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for coming on today. It's been great.
I'm glad to be with you. Thanks.